Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is the series where we take privacy-enhancing technologies out of the abstract and show you how they're actually being used in the real world. Welcome to Pets in Practice. Many of you have probably heard the term pets a lot lately, but for many teams, it still isn't exactly obvious what they do or how they fit into day-to-day business. The truth is, pets are already all around us, and without knowing it, you're probably using them every day when you browse online, use your phone, or if you're a beneficiary of some of the amazing technology and research breakthroughs coming from today's guest, Dr. Bradley Malin from Vanderbilt University. Brad is showing just how approachable these technologies are, letting businesses analyze data without moving it, collaborating with partners they never thought they could, and running fully secure and customized AI models. In this series, we're breaking it down. We'll look at what's pushing pets into mainstream adoption, the rise of secure AI, the pressure to get more value from data under strict regulations, and an ecosystem that's mature enough to make pets straightforward to roll out. And we'll hear from people who are already using them, what worked, what didn't, and what's now possible. So if you're looking for better, faster, and safer ways to collaborate and innovate with sensitive data, you're exactly in the right place. Today, we're diving into a space where we are all inherently a part of and understand the importance of privacy and security, medicine and healthcare. Everyone has come into contact with the medical system, but perhaps you don't know yet to what extent those interactions are enabled by AI and machine learning and how privacy and security is built in. And that's where today's guest comes in. I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Malin, the Accenture Professor of Biomedical Informatics and the Director of the Advanced AI Center at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. He and his team have been developing technologies to enable AI and machine learning in the context of organizational, policy, and health information architectures. He's both a developer and a user of privacy-enhancing technology, and we'll learn a bit more about his perspectives today. Brad, could you explain what you and your team do and why privacy technologies are the unseen engine behind the future of AI in the space?
Sure. So we work on the development of methods for the collection, analysis, and subsequent sharing of biomedical data of all sorts of types, everything from the clinical codes that are documented in an individual's medical record to genomic sequences and imaging information that you would come across. This is both for the purposes of doing model development in terms of exploration, as well as fine tuning of those models after you have something that's been built at one site and you want to transfer it over to another site. The work that we do, I would say, is it's not completely hidden from everybody. I think that there's recognition that there is some degree of protection that has been wrapped around the data for the development and application of the models. But at the end of the day, you're not doing privacy for privacy's sake. You're doing privacy to enable some particular use of the data. So we work on the foundations in a technical sense, but also on the policies, procedures, and organizational requirements that are necessary to translate the technology into practice. Because just developing the technology is important, but it's usually only about half the story.
And so you're bridging privacy and AI and research together and also governance and procedure too. So how do you define the most important privacy problems where you're looking at privacy technologies to solve those?
Yeah, it's an interesting question about what is privacy and under what circumstances do you have privacy. And so it will depend on the environment in which you're talking about it. So if we're talking about the collection and use of data for research purposes, you usually have two different scenarios. The traditional one is where the patient or the research subject is not involved in the determination of whether or not the data can be reused. So the data is collected and it's studied for the purposes of the development of some initial investigation or to facilitate the care of the patient. And then you have some secondary use, which is that the data is going to be redistributed or made more broadly available. And if the individual has not consented to it, then you're in a situation where you're going to invoke some type of a privacy enhancing technology. It may be that you're going to anonymize or de-identify the data in some way prior to putting it into the hands of the user so that they can interact with it without knowing who the patient is. If you do that, may end up reducing the fidelity of the data a bit. And so if people need to have analysis that is more fine-grained, then you may end up in a situation where it's more of a model development without actually looking at the data. So you're submitting a request to build a model of type A, and then the runs against the data, and then the model comes back and you check to see if that's going to actually be useful. Now, that's a situation, as I was alluding to, in which you have some secondary use of the data. You could also have a situation in which individuals have volunteered or consented to have their data used for research purposes. And then it's a question of what specifically are the terms under which they've agreed to have that information used. So you may have infrastructure that says that the people can come in and interact with the data in some enclave-like environment, and those types of enclaves have been built for various types of large cohort studies that we've supported in the United States. And in those situations, you're talking about not just reduction in the fidelity of the data. If you're willing to tolerate a little bit more detail in the data, then you may be saying who's allowed to come in and work with it, under what circumstances do they need to have an institution that has taken responsibility for their actions when they come in? What type of capabilities do the end users have with respect to the environment that they're working in? So, for instance, can they only do the development of their model in some sandboxed environment, or are they allowed to download information outside of that environment? And you may have a policy that says you can't download any individual level information, but you may be able to download the parameters of the model that you've developed within that environment. Now, in that situation, things get really interesting, especially as we're watching the development of AI over the last couple of years because of the fact that the models that are being developed are just bigger and bigger. And so you end up asking this question of what exactly have the parameters of that model retained with respect to the original records in that system. And so then you have to do some type of a model evaluation to ensure that the model is not necessarily going to leak out the records that it was trained on when it gets taken out of that environment. That's where you turn the problem into a little bit more of a statistical evaluation to determine whether or not that inference is possible.
Interesting. So you're describing a little bit of a spectrum, I think, right? On one side, you have anonymized data where the trade-off is quality. On the completely other side of the spectrum, you're using the data as is and you're more driven by governance and policy. And then there's maybe nuances in the middle in terms of how that data is used and for what purpose and the models and so on and so forth. So you're
Yeah.
describing much more than a simple HIPAA compliance challenge, right? You're reframing how data is used for research,
I
for
think
business purpose.
there's more than one way to get to a solution, right?
Mhm.
The thing that drives us is what are the constraints of the environment that you're dealing with. So let's say at the end of the day, it is HIPAA. The data was collected by a healthcare organization or some business associate, and the data is going to be shared in a manner such that you cannot disclose the identities of the individuals. Okay. The spectrum that I was alluding to provides the opportunity to create different types of solutions, but the end use case is going to depend on what somebody's going to do with the data and their comfort level in doing so. For example, let's say that I say you're not going to interact with individual level data, but you can build your model on top of the data, and then you get to work with that model. That process is considered de-identified. It is compliant with HIPAA, but now you build the model, or the user builds the model, and they go, so the model's doing some really weird stuff. I don't know if this is because the data was messed up or if it's in the wrong orientation or it's just dirty and it hasn't been cleaned. So I'm compliant with HIPAA, but I'm not happy with the result that came out of this. And so in that type of a situation, you would say, okay, then maybe we peel back the protections a little bit and we give you the ability to inspect the data, or we give you some additional quality control metrics associated with the data that went into the model. It really becomes a question of at what point is somebody comfortable with the result that's come out.
Interesting. Okay, so you're working backwards and saying, I have some sort of problem I'm trying to solve. You're using privacy and governance to solve that problem, but you really don't know if you're getting it right and you have to tweak it along the way based on the output that you're getting.
Usually, yes. It's challenging because you have two different situations here. So in the biomedical research world, you may not know what it is that you're trying to build initially. And this is where people get
Hmm.
a little frustrated with if all you tell them is they can only work with model development, right? There's going to need to be some initial learning or some initial development of comfort with the data. And so you may say, so here's the data as it currently looks. It's a de-identified version of the data. It might even be, and we haven't talked about this, it might even be some synthetic version of the data so that people can get their hands wet with it. And then once you're comfortable with it, then you can say, okay, now it's time to shift over to the model development, where if you're comfortable with what the data is and how it's oriented, now here's what the model looks like after you've gone and done your build. It's the process in the biomedical research world, which is different than if you just wanted to do something at inference time.
Maybe that's an extreme example, but if you don't necessarily know what you're trying to build or what you're trying to do at the outset, how are you able to measure the return on investment or the value of doing this process and incorporating the privacy technologies into it from a researcher perspective or hospital or pharma? Like, how do you help your stakeholders think through that?
Yeah, that's a $1 billion question. I'm not sure I'm always good at answering that question because depends on how you want to characterize it. So, basic science is a very difficult thing to put a monetary number to in terms of what you want to support, right? There's this
Mhm.
expectation that if you invest in basic science, you may not have a return on investment for years into the future. And by years, it's not necessarily 5 to 6 years. It could be like 10, it could be 20 years. And so there's this expectation that you invest in the infrastructure, you give people access to or opportunity to develop hypotheses that they can then continue to investigate over time. And it may lead to a win. You may end up leading to some new repurposing for a drug, or it may lead to a suggestion for a particular population that is ripe for targeting with a particular medication. But it's not instantaneous. Now, that's different than if you were trying to support post-market evaluation of a particular pharmaceutical or a particular intervention that has been introduced into the healthcare arena, right? And so in that situation, you can still have privacy technology come to the table to say, hey, I want to evaluate and potentially refine a policy or refine a strategy for putting this healthcare technology out there. But in that situation, you can measure the return on investment relatively quickly, right? So if somebody says, hey, we put this drug out there, we want to know if people are being discharged at a faster rate than they were before. Very easy to do the assessment at that point, and you have a very clear monetary savings during that evaluation. But basic science is a different story, and you're basically saying, trust me into the future.
So, what are the sort of families of challenges that you focus on with your team? Is it more on the basic science side, which is harder to quantify, or is it more, let's say, business driven and needs an ROI? And how do you
It's
balance
both.
discussions with funders and with regulatory and compliance people on why are you doing this and how much money am I supposed to give you in order to do this? How do you have that
Yeah.
conversation?
It depends on the expected goal, right? Or the expected return, as you're alluding to. So if you're talking about basic science, you're talking about funders that are similar to the National Institutes of Health who recognize that basic science is going to be the foundation for future developments within healthcare. Okay. And they acknowledge that they are not going to be making money off of whatever that investment is going to look like, right? So that's what grants are allocated for, on the expectation that in the long run, you're going to generate better healthcare and economic returns. Okay. So when you're talking with them, you're talking about, are we doing something that we have not done before? Are we creating new types of infrastructure for collecting and analyzing and sharing biomedical data in ways that we just have not considered doing yet. And can we do it at scale? Right? They don't want to do things that are one-offs. They want to do things that are reproducible, makes it easier for other people to see the potential for doing this type of scientific investigation. Okay, so I think the NIH looks at this as with big risk but big return. Okay, so they can tolerate that there's going to be failures because that is basic science at the end of the day. If you're doing this on a more corporate level, so let's say that you have a healthcare organization that is going to try and commercialize data, or they're going to try and monetize that data, then you have to ask the question of what exactly is the return on investment at that point. So, from a privacy perspective, you can say one of two things is going to happen. Either you're going to have a situation where privacy gets in the way, where they say that without this technology, you would never be able to share this data or get some type of monetization around it to begin with, right? Or you have a situation that says that you are doing this, you are sharing the data, but you're playing fast and loose, and there's a chance that you may end up disclosing data in a manner that you were not intending to do, or the law says was not permissible. At which point, then you're saying you're going to get some benefit, but you may end up sustaining some massive losses, which could be monetary fines up to massive reputational damage. So when you're in that situation, there's a much clearer cost benefit analysis that can be done at the end of the day, right? So you're selling it differently in that respect.
But I guess what you're describing is, in a sense, two worlds where privacy technologies are either used as a risk reduction or as a way to unlock data when privacy is a blocker already. Those are maybe the two overarching families of when you would consider using such a technology that you've done in the past.
Yeah, I think it's a carrot or stick, right?
Hmm.
So
Yep.
you're either going to enable something that you were unable to do before, or you're trying to mitigate risk in a situation that has the potential for risk.
And so, given that, and given very different worlds, right? Basic science versus pharmaceuticals, let's say, in your experience, what's the hardest part of turning a privacy technology from a promising method to, let's say, unlock data or reduce risk into an operational system? And you're coming at this, I guess, for the audience to know you've created different privacy technology methods and ways
Yeah.
to work with them. So, how have you seen going from idea to actually use, right? How have you seen that happen over time?
So it's a great question. I think there's two aspects. First is that you can't just build the technology and expect that people are going to use it. You have to dock it to the anticipated workflow. So if you just offer the protection model and you say, look, we have created an opportunity for you to build a model or do some analysis, and privacy is going to be protected in the legal sense, you usually end up in a situation initially where people just go, this is interesting, but that's not really what I'm trying to do. Right. And so you really have to take a step back and say, so, okay, what exactly is it that you're trying to accomplish here? And then orient the technology to support that. And the user studies and the UX become insanely important at that point in time. Probably the harder part is that even if you build the technology and you make the claims that it's compliant, you still are going to have to get through some type of legal approval or organizational approval, right? So I'll give an example. So I could create a situation where I build a technology that will create a synthetic version of the entire electronic medical record system for an organization. And it'd be like, look, you can now have this data go out the door. You could commercialize it. You could share it. You could do whatever you want. You're still going to have lawyers who come in and say, are you sure that the risk is sufficiently low with respect to the law? And the answer is you're never going to be able to guarantee that's the case. You're going to be able to give an argument that says that it's low, but there's always going to be a different perspective on what is considered to be an acceptable level of risk, right? And this creates a really major tension because if an organization is trying to mitigate their overall risk profile, they may say, look, we're just not willing to tolerate this. And so even though your technology sounds fantastic, we're just not going to use it because it opens us up to some degree of criticism or there's uncertainty in the legal sense. That is a very challenging scenario to deal with. And so you have to make sure that the organization and risk management is on board, like right from day one. Because if you don't, you're going to end up developing a technology and you're going to end up trying to sell it, and then nobody's going to want it, right? And it could be completely fit for purpose. Every scientific investigator, every analyst is going to be really interested in this. And then policy or compliance or legal is going to come in and they're going to say, not for us.
Given that, how do you communicate what you're working on, what it means from a compliance and a risk perspective? And also, maybe as a sub part to that, given your work with NIH and the fact that you serve on the technical anonymization group for the European Medicine Agency, how do you handle that even in an international context or across organizations that might even have different levels of risk and different viewpoints on compliance, for instance?
Yeah, it's constant blending of the technologists with the policy and legal people. You don't go off and work in a vacuum. It's a constant trade-off or collaboration between the two, where you're getting requirements engineering that is set or requirements that are set by people who set the boundary conditions, and then the technologist can come in and say, okay, this is what you can build within that space. But it is a little bit of an iterative process because you could have boundary conditions that get set, and the technologist says, I can't build anything given those boundaries. And then you might be able to say, but I could show you technology that could do this. And then is that consistent with your boundaries? And they may go, oh, well, we've never considered a technology like that. Let's actually run the investigation. Let's try and define what the principles are. Synthetic data is a great example of this challenge because in the law, synthetic
Mhm.
data doesn't really get discussed very often. And so you're constantly asking, what is the legal interpretation of synthetic data? So if an organization wants to share synthetic data, are they trying to make a claim that it is de-identified under the law in the US? Are they trying to make an argument that it's anonymous with respect to GDPR? And you then have to try to have a docking of what privacy claims that you're making, like how those claims relate to what legal requirements are. And the technologist is not going to make that docking. You're going to need to have legal expertise that says this is how we translate that into how legal works, the legal perspective would think about it. It's a multidisciplinary process for privacy in that respect, right? So at the end of the day, the privacy enhancing technology gets you to a point where it's, I know that I could achieve these types of protections, but you still need to have some translator that is going to bring this back into either a technical, a legal context, or a business context, or policy compliance context, because you're not the decision maker for that organization at the end of the day.
Who are those translators then? Is it like a creative lawyer? Is that basically what it comes down to? Is someone who understands, let's say, legal and compliance, but has dipped his or her toe into tech before, or sees the vision and figures out a way to work within it? It seems like a kind of a special type of person.
It's all over the place, but yeah, I would say it could be a good lawyer. It could be people who are just policymakers and policy managers, people who have
Mm.
the ability to make decisions for an organization. Because at the end of the day, the lawyer, it will never be able to tell you if something is legal or not until they actually end up in front of a judge, right? Instead, what
Yeah.
the lawyer is doing is making interpretation of the law and saying, this is where I think the risk is, this is the extent to which I think that we're compliant, and now somebody still has to be the ultimate decision maker at the end of the day. It's not the lawyer, it's not the technologist, it's somebody who sits higher up within the organization that is saying, we're going to take this leap. You do need to be able to have a conversation with that tech savvy lawyer because otherwise the lawyer is just going to go, this stuff is way too complex. We're never going to be able to explain this. And therefore, we have no idea how this relates to the law. Sorry, techie, you're lost at this point.
So yeah, for any lawyers listening to this, we need your help. Basically what it comes down
I think
to.
it's true. I think it's true.
I want to shift gears a little bit and dip our toe a little bit more into the technology here. And we'll touch on AI, we'll touch on synthetic data, which you've brought up, and maybe get a little bit into the future. But given that you're deeply familiar with privacy technologies, and you've already kind of mentioned a couple already, which technologies do you think are likely to matter over the next few years within AI and biomedicine, and why?
I think increasingly what we're seeing is federated learning is becoming a big one in that for organizations that don't feel comfortable showing any of their data, federated learning, possibly in combination with some agent-based technology, I think is going to be at the forefront. As much as I love crypto and I love secure multi-party computation or homomorphic encryption, I think at least in the biomedical research world, it's extremely difficult to implement because these are technologies that when you know exactly what it is that you're going to do with the data, you can set up the cryptographic processes to facilitate the analysis over and over again. But if you're in an exploratory and hypothesis generating situation, the users get a little cagey because of the fact that they're like, I don't know if the data is what exactly it is that you're suggesting it is. Surprisingly, I still think that de-identification from a risk-based perspective is still going to be at the table for a while. I don't think that we're going to get away from the situations where people are going to want to scratch, sniff, lick, taste the data a little bit. But what you're going to end up with is you're going to end up with more enclave-like environments for hosting the data and allowing people to do development and possibly invoke AI models that they're going to want to bring in and use for analytic purposes.
And when you say enclave, just for clarity, do you mean like a trusted execution environment, like a secure chip, or a clean room, or more a physical location?
More like sandboxed virtual environments
Got
online.
it.
I think the trusted execution environments are going to be very similar to like encrypted environments, right? So you have a secure zone, but again, if you can't see anything that's going on in there, from a research perspective, it doesn't help you that much. It's not helping you refine your hypotheses, helping you refine your analytics at all.
And you didn't mention synthetic data in this.
So I think synthetic data is great for the purposes of showing people what's in your data and allowing them to formulate initial hypotheses. I will part on my sleeve, and even though I have grant funding from the NIH, I will say I don't think that it's useful for hypothesis testing. Because at the end of the day, you're going to have to go back to the original data. If the synthetic data is exactly the same as the real data, then you might as well just publish what we all already know about the real data. There's no reason for the synthetic data to exist at that point. I think synthetic data is useful for a lot of things. From a privacy perspective, I think it's more about giving people intuition into what's in a data set that they haven't seen yet.
Interesting. So overall, synthetic data has its use for initial hypothesis building, but when you're going into the actual testing, that's where you see more about federated learning, de-identification, here to stay, as you say, and the sandbox virtual environments for the actual research.
Yes, for the time being.
I know we're tight on time, so one last question is, where are you headed with your research? What seems promising to you? And given your history of innovation in this space, what advice would you give people or organizations that are starting to look into privacy technologies and where they might consider using it?
I'm not going to pigeonhole myself with respect to any particular technology. We really look at all of them. I know that sounds crazy, but the reason why I say that is every technology is fit for a different purpose. So we look at what the problems are that people are trying to solve, and then we bring the right technology. We try to bring the right technology to that problem rather than try to say we're going to build a foundational technology and then see. In that situation, you end up with a hammer always looking for a nail, and I'd rather
Mhm.
develop technology that's appropriate for the moment. So if I have to offer advice to people, it's work with the actual practitioners, right? If you don't know what people need at the end of the day, as I was alluding to before, you will end up building technology that does not transfer. And so you have to have real world use cases, and you need to have people who are serving in an advisory capability that have an understanding of just what people are doing. Otherwise, you're building technology for technology's sake.
So basically, look at the ends, what you want to achieve. Technology should be an enabler to that, and make sure you know what you're building and for whom fit into the workflows. That's the
Yep.
sage
Fit for
advice.
fit for purpose technology.
Fantastic. That is a great way to end. Fit for purpose technology. Brad, thank you very much for your time. This has been very interesting. I've learned a lot, and have a great rest of the day.
Yeah, thanks. You too. Appreciate the opportunity.
Hello, everyone.